The front door of Shadowcrest Manor did not so much open as it surrendered. Sophie Quinn put her shoulder into it a second time, heard the ancient iron hinges shriek like something was dying, and then the door swung inward with a dramatic groan that scattered a small cloud of dust, and what she was fairly certain was the desiccated wing of something that no longer existed in any mainstream biology textbook. A cold, musty darkness exhaled outward to meet her, carrying with it the distinct perfume of rust, old leather, 3 centuries of accumulated supernatural junk, and the faint, sweet rot of something she was absolutely going to need her heavy-duty trash bags for. Sophie stepped inside, dragging her utility cart over the threshold with a solid thunk, and turned on her headlamp. "Oh," she said. She stood in what had presumably once been a grand entrance hall. The operative word was once. Floor to ceiling, and the ceiling was genuinely impressive. Vaulted stone archways, disappearing into shadows 20 feet above her. Every available surface had been colonized by stuff. A full suit of plate armor slumped against the left wall, its visor propped open, a dented pewter goblet sitting inexplicably inside the helmet. Beside it, a stack of oil paintings leaned in a teetering column. Portraits, landscapes, one that appeared to depict a man wrestling a bear the size of a cottage. A wooden rack held 7 swords, 2 axes, one item that might have been a halberd, or might have been someone's very ambitious attempt at home carpentry, and something at the end she genuinely could not identify, but that was emitting a low, barely audible hum. To the right, wooden crates were stacked 4 high, several of them stenciled with warning sigils that she recognized from the reference guide her client's solicitor had sent over. Along the base of the far wall, a parade of ceramic urns, iron-bound chests, mismatched candelabras, bundled rolled tapestries, and loose piles of what appeared to be ancient coins mixed with modern takeout containers formed a continuous archaeological stratum that stretched the entire width of the hall and disappeared into the corridor beyond. A taxidermied wolf the size of a small pony crouched on a plinth near the staircase with an expression of permanent outrage. Sophie pulled her measuring tape from the front pocket of her cargo apron, clicked it out, and made her first notation on her intake form. Entrance hall? Compromised. Primary pathways? Non-existent. Fire egress? Catastrophic. Emotional attachment level of client? To be assessed. But initial indicators suggest extreme. She capped her pen, tucked the form back into her apron, and began pushing the utility cart deeper into the hall, methodically scanning left and right, mentally sorting, categorizing, building the grid in her head the way she always did in the first 5 minutes of a new job. The armor, probable sentimental keep, display solution needed. The swords, functionality assessment required, likely a specialized rack system. The hum, she glanced at the end of the weapon rack as she passed and decided the humming item was going into a sealed container, pending a consult with the specialist her agency kept on retainer for exactly this type of situation. She was 3 steps into the corridor beyond when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not the slow chill of an old drafty house bleeding heat into autumn air. The temperature dropped the way a curtain falls. Sudden, total, and theatrical. The cold settled onto her skin like a held breath. Sophie looked up from her intake form. He was standing in the corridor ahead of her. She had read the client file twice on the drive over. She had noted the pertinent details, cross-referenced the supplementary materials his solicitor had provided, and felt she had prepared herself adequately. The file had described him as intimidating in person. The file had, it was now clear, been engaging in some fairly dramatic understatement. He was enormous. 6 feet 4 inches of sheer, coiled physical mass, filling the corridor the way a boulder fills a riverbed, naturally and without apparent effort. His shoulders were broad enough that he had turned slightly sideways without seeming to realize it, an unconscious adaptation to a world that had been built for smaller beings. Dark hair, thick and unkempt, fell across his forehead. His jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line. He wore a dark shirt, with the sleeves pushed up over forearms roped with muscle, and several fading marks that were almost certainly not tattoos. He was, objectively and somewhat inconveniently, one of the most physically striking human-adjacent beings Sophie had ever seen in her professional career. His eyes were glowing red. Not metaphorically, not the bloodshot red of a man who had not slept. They were burning, a deep amber red like heated coals, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that communicated, with perfect clarity, that she was the most unwelcome thing that had ever crossed his threshold, including, presumably, whatever had made the stain on the flagstones to his left. The cold emanating from him was not coming from the stone or the drafts. It was coming from him. An invisible pressure that rolled outward like a tide, heavy and suffocating, designed by 300 years of evolution and dominance to do exactly one thing: make whatever was in front of him turn around and leave very quickly. Sophie felt it settle across her shoulders like a weighted blanket. She looked at him over the top of her intake form. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I'm Sophie Quinn from Clarity Professional Organizing. Your solicitor booked the full estate consultation, starting today. You should have received the confirmation." Silence. His eyes intensified, if that was possible. The pressure in the air around him thickened. Somewhere in the walls, something groaned. "This," he said, and his voice was very low, carrying the kind of resonance that suggested it had been used to issue commands to large groups of beings who did not require much convincing, "is my den, my territory. You are trespassing in a sacred space, and you have approximately 10 seconds to remove yourself and your cart before I remove you." Sophie finished writing her notation. She tucked the form under her arm, pulled the measuring tape from her apron again, and stepped forward. He did not move. She walked to within 3 feet of him and extended the measuring tape, clicking it out horizontally at the level of his chest. He looked down at it. He looked at her. The red in his eyes flickered. "Your chest measurement," she said, making a note, "combined with your shoulder width. What are you, 6'4"? 6'5"? She glanced up without waiting for an answer, already turning to look at the corridor walls on either side of him. "Right. So your total dynamic clearance, meaning the space you need to move through a corridor without clipping things, is going to be significantly wider than a standard adult passage. I'm seeing 17th century gargoyle replicas. Are those original?" She leaned slightly to peer past his arm at a stone figure crouched on a low shelf. "Because you have been catching them with your elbow. There are fresh chips on the base of at least 3 of them that match the height of your left arm in motion. You've also scupped the wood paneling on both sides at shoulder height all the way down this corridor, which tells me your walking paths are entirely blocked." He was staring at her. The supernatural cold had not exactly receded, but it had stopped advancing. The way a wave pauses at its peak before it decides what to do next. Sophie snapped the measuring tape back into its case and reached into the deep right pocket of her cargo apron. She produced a spray bottle of lavender cleaning solution, gave it a single preparatory pump in the air near his left side, and the fine mist drifted between them with its clean, herbal smell, cutting directly through 3 centuries of dust and territorial pheromones. Ronan Blackwood flinched. It was very small. She noted it with professional satisfaction. From the same pocket, she produced a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves, snapped them out to their full extension with a crisp, clean sound, and held them out to him. He looked at the gloves. He looked at her face. He looked at the gloves again. "Phase 1, Sophie said cheerfully, is the purge. We assess every item in the space for function, condition, and genuine necessity, and we make decisions. Quick decisions. No revisiting. I'll lead the assessment. You make the final calls on anything flagged as high attachment, and we work our way systematically from the entrance hall through to the back of the property." She gave the gloves a small, encouraging shake. "I'd recommend the gloves. Some of what's in those crates I would rather neither of us touch barehanded until we know what it is." Ronan Blackwood, Alpha King of the Blackwood Pack, master of Shadowcrest Manor, creature of 3 centuries of unchallenged dominance, looked at the small blonde woman standing in the wreckage of his corridor, holding a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves and a lavender spray bottle, her headlamp illuminating the absolute chaos he had spent 300 years carefully accumulating, and he did not say anything at all. He had killed things. He had commanded armies. He had survived wars that predated the founding of nations. He had never once, in all of that time, been handed rubber gloves. Sophie set the gloves on top of a nearby crate, turned back to her utility cart, and began unfolding her first set of heavy-duty color-coded sorting bags with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and expected, completely reasonably, to do it 1,000 more. "We'll start," she said, "with the armor." He did not sit on the tarp willingly. That point needed to be made clearly, for the record, to whatever cosmic audience was apparently now witnessing the complete unraveling of Ronan Blackwood's dignity. He had not sat down because she had asked him to. He had sat down because she had looked at him with those clear, patient blue eyes and said, in the exact tone of a person explaining something to someone who was trying their best but struggling, that she needed him within arm's reach of the assessment process so he could make real-time retention decisions, and the most efficient position for that was seated on the tarp she had laid out in the center of his living room floor, so they did not continue inhaling 3 centuries of particulate matter from the rugs, which were, by the way, a genuine historical tragedy, and she was going to need the name of a specialist. The tarp was blue. It crinkled every time he shifted his weight. It was the single most undignified surface he had ever been asked to occupy, and he had once spent 4 days trapped in a pit in the Carpathian Mountains. He sat cross-legged in the center of it, his massive frame folded with the slightly stiff precision of a man who did not spend a great deal of time sitting cross-legged, and watched Sophie Quinn dismantle his living room with the calm, systematic energy of a natural disaster that had attended a professional certification course. She had established what she called a processing station near the fireplace, which in practice meant she had moved his collection of 16th century iron candlesticks into a temporary holding cluster, spread a second tarp over the surface of the sideboard, and set up her color-coded bag system in a row along the wall. Blue for recycle, black for dispose, a clear bag with a green label for donate, which she had explained to him twice despite his repeated clarification that he did not donate things. A 4th bag, sealed and heavy-duty, in bright orange, which she had labeled with her electronic label maker in neat block letters, Specialist Review, Possible Hazard. The label maker had made a small, satisfied beeping sound when it printed. Sophie had smoothed the label onto the bag with her thumb and looked faintly pleased, the way other people looked when something they had been hoping for turned out better than expected. Ronan had watched the whole procedure from the tarp. "Next item," Sophie said, and turned from the sideboard. She was holding the axe with both hands, blade down, the way someone holds a thing they respect enough not to be careless with. It was old. Even by his standards, it was old. Iron gone, the deep brownish gray of something that had spent significant time in contact with the earth. The edge still present, but pocked and rough. The wooden haft cracked along its length and bound with a wrap of leather that had dried to something closer to jerky. There was a stain near the top of the haft that had never fully come out and never would, because it was over 1,000 years old. "Viking period, I'm guessing," Sophie said, turning it in the light. She set it down horizontally on the processing station and produced a small flashlight, bending to examine the iron head. "There's significant oxidation across the full surface. The haft is structurally compromised and—" She tilted her head and brought the flashlight closer. "Is that blood?" "Trophy," Ronan said. Sophie straightened and looked at him. "A trophy. From a slain enemy." He paused. "A very significant slain enemy. I see." She made a note. She set the flashlight down with the neat, decisive motion of someone completing a thought. "And where is it displayed?" Ronan said nothing for a moment. "It was in the 3rd crate, from the entrance hall." "So it's been in a crate? For preservation." "For approximately how long?" Another pause. He was not going to tell her. She was writing something on her intake form anyway, with the serene confidence of someone who already knew. The sound of her pen on paper was the loudest thing in the room. "Here's what I can tell you," Sophie said, setting the form down and giving the axe her full professional attention. "This item has no current display solution, no functional application, and represents a genuine tetanus risk to anyone who handles it without gloves. Which is why," she paused and looked at him pointedly, "I asked you to wear the gloves." She looked at the gloves, still sitting on the processing station where he had refused to put them on. She looked back at him. She did not say anything else about the gloves. The sentimental value is high, I understand that, but sentimental value and retention value are not automatically the same thing. So I want you to do something for me. I'm not going to— Close your eyes, he stared at her. Close your eyes, Mr. Blackwood. This is a standard part of the process. I do not close my eyes in front of people. I understand that feels counterintuitive given your instincts, but I promise you the axe is not going anywhere in the next 30 seconds. She waited. Her expression was that of someone with infinite patience and a very clear idea of how this was going to end. Close your eyes. Hold the concept of the axe in your mind. Not the history, not the context, just the object. How it makes you feel right now, in this moment. Does it make you feel good? Does it spark something genuine and positive when you think about it? Or does it just feel like a weight? Ronan Blackwood, who had not closed his eyes voluntarily in a vulnerable situation since approximately the 17th century, closed his eyes. He thought about the axe. He thought, if he was being precise, about the damp dark of the third crate, where the axe had been sitting under a length of burlap next to a broken astrolabe and 2 cannonballs he had forgotten he owned. He thought about the fact that he had not looked at it in. He ran the calculation, and the result was uncomfortable. He thought about the enemy it had come from, and found that the memory, once vivid, had softened over centuries into something more like a story he had heard than something he had lived. I don't, he started. The blue bag rustled. He opened his eyes. Sophie was smoothing the top of the recycle bag closed over the axe with the brisk efficiency of someone who had heard everything she needed to hear in that half-second of hesitation. You hesitated, she said, without looking up. Hesitation in the spark joy assessment means the object is being retained out of obligation rather than genuine connection. That's not a good reason to keep something. She pressed the seal on the bag and moved it to the blue row against the wall. The memory of the enemy is yours. You keep that. The rusting iron goes. Ronan looked at the blue bag. He was aware of a sensation that was not quite outrage, and not quite the thing that came after outrage, when outrage got tired and sat down. He wanted to argue. He had several arguments prepared. He did not produce any of them, because she had already turned back to the processing station and was moving on. And arguing with Sophie Quinn, he was beginning to understand, was like arguing with a tide. Not because she was loud or forceful, but because she simply continued. He watched her work. She moved through his living room the way she had moved through his corridor, with total unself-conscious purpose, reading the space the way he read terrain, identifying load-bearing points and problem areas and solutions that had not occurred to him, because they had never occurred to him. Because in 300 years, nobody had ever suggested that the accumulation was a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be accommodated. Her hands were quick and sure. She wiped down a shelf, noted the wood grain underneath the grime with a small sound of approval, measured a wall section with the tape, and began moving items into new groupings with a logic he could not entirely follow, but that resolved, slowly, into an order he could feel rather than see. The room was changing. Not dramatically. Not yet, but the chaos, which had existed so long, it had stopped registering as chaos and started registering as simply the texture of the space, was beginning to have shape. Breathing room was appearing between objects. The fireplace, buried behind 4 crates and a broken spinning wheel for longer than he could clearly remember, was becoming visible again. The stone surround, emerging from obscurity, like something surfacing from deep water. It was warm there. He had forgotten how the firelight fell across that stone. Ronan sat on the blue tarp and watched Sophie Quinn wipe dust from a shelf that had not seen light in decades, her headlamp catching the gold in her hair, her cargo apron swinging with the small orderly weight of her tools, her lips moving faintly as she counted something under her breath. And something happened inside him that he did not immediately have a name for. It started deep, below conscious thought, below language. A resonance, slow and low, like a sound heard through stone. His wolf, which spent most of its time in a state of coiled territorial readiness that was the supernatural equivalent of a man sitting across from someone he does not trust with his hands where he can see them, went very still. And then, with no permission from the rest of him, it began to purr. Not literally, not a sound anyone in the room would hear, but inside the framework of him, in the ancient instinctive architecture that 300 years of civilization had draped but never dismantled, something that had been waiting its entire existence recognized what was happening in front of it and responded with a depth of satisfaction that stopped his breath. She was building a nest, not her nest. She moved through the space with professional detachment, cataloging and solving, her interest in the objects themselves entirely functional. But the result, the cleared paths, the emerging order, the slow revelation of the bones of his home underneath the accumulated weight of centuries, the result was a den. His den, structured and tended and made livable, shaped by her hands. She was building it for him. The old instinct, which operated on logic that predated rational thought by several thousand years, drew the only conclusion available to it. The conclusion it was designed to draw when an alpha found his territory being tended by someone who was not afraid of him, who smelled of lavender and useful things, whose hands moved through his space as if she already knew it. She is building it for us. Ronan stared at the back of Sophie's head as she reached up to measure the highest shelf, her bun slightly escaping its pins from the exertion of the last hour, a smear of centuries-old dust across the back of her cargo apron, and felt the purr deepen into something that pressed against the inside of his ribs, with a warmth he had not felt in so long. The sensation was almost unrecognizable. Sophie stepped back from the shelf, made a note, turned around, and found him looking at her. "You're not moving," she said. "No," he said. She considered him for a moment with her head tilted, the way she considered the items on the processing station, assessing, categorizing, deciding. Then she reached into her cargo apron, produced a second pair of bright yellow rubber gloves, and held them out. "The crates from the corridor aren't going to sort themselves," she said. He looked at the gloves for a long moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man making a decision that he suspects will have consequences he cannot yet fully calculate, Ronan Blackwood reached out and took them. By the third day, Shadowcrest Manor had a floor. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. For the better part of 3 centuries, the floor of Shadowcrest Manor had been a theoretical concept, something everyone agreed existed in principle, but that nobody had seen in practice beneath the accumulated archaeological weight of an immortal hoarder's nesting instinct. Now it was visible. Not just visible, it gleamed. The hardwood, once presumed to be a uniform dark brown, turned out to be a rich, warm amber, with a grain like rippled water. And Sophie had spent the better part of yesterday afternoon on her knees with a buffer and a professional-grade floor wax that she had sourced from a specialty supplier and applied in 2 coats with the focused reverence of someone doing something genuinely important. The entrance hall was clear. The corridor had 2 feet of walking space on each side of its center path, which meant Ronan could move through it without clipping any of the gargoyle replicas, 3 of which had survived assessment and been properly mounted on purpose-built brackets at a height calibrated to his shoulder clearance. The living room had a seating area, an actual seating area, with 2 chairs and a low table that had emerged from beneath a pile of mixed-century debris and turned out to be a beautiful piece of dark walnut that made Sophie produce a sound of genuine anguish at what had been done to it before she set about correcting the damage. The fireplace was fully exposed. She had lit it the previous evening to test the draw, and Ronan had sat in one of the salvaged chairs and looked at the fire for a long time without saying anything, which she had interpreted as satisfaction and filed under confirmed client progress. The weapons had been addressed. The genuinely functional, non-cursed ones had been mounted in a dedicated display room off the main hall, organized chronologically and labeled, because Sophie had brought the label maker to his collection of medieval armaments, and there was nothing Ronan had been able to do about it. The cursed items had gone to the specialist. The humming object had been collected by a very calm woman in a hazmat-adjacent outfit, who had not given her name and had not seemed surprised by anything, which Sophie respected professionally. The sorting had resulted in 11 bags for disposal, 4 crates for specialist review, 2 items flagged for Historical Society donation that Ronan had eventually, after a negotiation Sophie would categorize as protracted, agreed to, and a single shelf in the back study that he had designated his absolute non-negotiable retention zone, which she had allowed because every client got one, and because the items on it, an old compass, a folded piece of paper she had not been permitted to open, 2 small stones that looked completely ordinary, and a dented tin cup, had made something in his jaw go tight when she picked them up, and Sophie knew the difference between hoarding and keeping. The manor did not just look different. It felt different. Lighter, like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time had finally, cautiously, exhaled. Sophie was high up on her tall A-frame ladder when she heard the back doors go. She had the chandelier in the main hall, the one directly above the entrance, the one she had been promising herself she would get to since day one. It was extraordinary. Wrought iron with 12 arms and glass drops that had not seen a cleaning cloth since approximately the reign of someone long dead. And she was working her way methodically around its circumference with a microfiber cloth and a vinegar solution when the sound hit. Not a knock, not the careful noise of something being opened, but the flat, concussive crack of something being forced. Wood and iron giving way under sudden impact. Sophie paused on the ladder and listened. Footsteps. Multiple. Fast and deliberate. Moving through the back of the manor with the specific, purposeful rhythm of people who had not been invited and knew it and did not care. She heard Ronan come off the landing above, the particular heaviness of his footfall that she had learned to recognize over 3 days, moving fast, the floor vibrating faintly with it through the soles of her shoes on the step stool. Then the first 2 came through the corridor into the entrance hall at a dead run. They were moving with preternatural speed, which was why neither of them had any chance at all of correcting when their feet hit the freshly waxed hardwood, and the wax, which Sophie had applied in 2 coats and left to cure for a full 18 hours, did exactly what 2 coats of professional-grade floor wax do to the forward momentum of someone moving at inhuman speed. The first one went down so fast it was almost architectural. Both feet left the floor. There was a brief moment of horizontal suspension, and then he connected with the hardwood with a full-body impact that sent him skidding the entire length of the entrance hall on his back directly into the large item sorting station Sophie had positioned against the far wall, pending the collection service's arrival. The second one tried to stop, which was the wrong instinct on waxed hardwood at speed, and the attempt to brake converted his forward momentum into a sideways spin that deposited him into a standing suit of armor, not the original entrance hall suit, which had been properly stored, but the one she had designated for recycle and left assembled as a shape for transport, and the armor folded over him with a clanging, comprehensive series of impacts, and sat on him. From the large item station, where the first one was now attempting to stand up, there came a sustained crashing as he connected with the stacked items in sequence. The broken chairs, the dismantled bed frame sections, the decorative iron gate that had come off a garden entrance and had nowhere else to go. He went through all of it. The gate, in particular, got involved in his exit in a way that left him thoroughly interwoven with its scrollwork, sitting in a pile of sorted non-recyclables with an expression of profound disorientation. Sophie, from her vantage point on the ladder, had turned around to watch this. There were more coming. She could hear them through the back corridor, 3 more sets of footsteps, and she could hear Ronan somewhere behind them moving to intercept. And she processed all of this information and made a rapid professional assessment of the tactical situation. Then the third one came through the corridor entrance and put his boot directly in the center of the Persian rug. The Persian rug that she had spent 4 hours on. The Persian rug that had turned out, under its ingrained coating of centuries, to be a deep crimson and gold medallion pattern of genuinely exceptional quality that had made her sit back on her heels and take a moment. The Persian rug that she had cleaned with a specialist solution on her hands and knees, carefully, section by section, testing the fiber response, working the pile back to its proper direction. He put a muddy boot print in the dead center of it. Sophie descended the ladder quickly. She did not think about this. She did not consider the tactical landscape, or assess the supernatural threat level, or do any of the reasonable things a person might do when faced with a dangerous intruder in a large, dark manor house. She moved on pure professional reflex, reaching into the cargo apron as she descended, and what came out was not the lavender spray bottle. It was the industrial stain remover. It was kept in the left pocket, separate from the other bottles, because it was not suitable for most surfaces and required direct targeted application, and Sophie had excellent pocket organization. "Excuse me," she said. The third one turned. She hit him with a sustained spray of industrial stain remover directly at eye level, because that was the height her arm reached from her standing position relative to his face. An industrial stain remover, which is formulated to break down complex organic compounds under pressure, is not a pleasant thing to have applied to your eyes at close range under any circumstances. And vampires, it turned out, were not an exception. The noise he made was not dignified. He reeled backward, directly off the Persian rug, which Sophie tracked to make sure, and collided with the wall of the corridor, and she was already moving forward with the spray bottle leading, driving him back away from the rug with the focused fury of someone who has just watched 4 hours of careful work get a muddy boot print put through it. "That rug," she said, as he made further undignified noises, "took me from 9 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. If you look down at your boot right now and there is still mud on it, I need you to understand that I am genuinely very upset with you." From the entrance hall behind her, the sound of the 4th and 5th intruders hitting the waxed hardwood, because it was still waxed regardless of the circumstances, produced the same results as the first two. There was skidding. There was crashing. There was the specific clanging of the second suit of armor getting involved. Ronan arrived into the entrance hall from the far corridor with the 5th one already in hand, which was not a small achievement given the size differential between them, except that Ronan's size differential with most things was significant, and he moved through physical confrontation the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance with 3 centuries of practiced ease. He stopped. He stood in the entrance hall, which was gleaming and organized and structured and clear, and looked at it. He looked at Sophie, who was standing at the corridor entrance with an industrial spray bottle and an expression of someone experiencing genuine personal offense on behalf of a rug. He looked at the 4 intruders in various states of incapacity across his entrance hall, wrapped in iron scrollwork and flattened under salvage armor, and spread across the large items sorting station. He looked at the muddy boot print on the Persian rug. Something in Ronan Blackwood's face shifted from combat-focused to something quieter and considerably more dangerous. "That," Sophie said, from the corridor entrance, "is a genuine antique. Do you know how long it took me to restore that pile direction?" Ronan looked at the remaining 2 who were still technically functional, attempting to disentangle themselves from the large items station with the desperate energy of people who had arrived intending to assassinate an Alpha King and had somehow ended up losing to a floor wax and a woman with a spray bottle. He walked to the nearest window. It was a large window, tall and iron-framed, looking out onto the grounds. He opened it. The fact that he opened it first, rather than simply using it, suggested a level of domestic consideration that would not have occurred to him 4 days ago. He picked up the first one and put him through the window. Cleanly, with the careful, deliberate energy of someone removing something from a space where it did not belong, rather than the violent energy of combat. "The rug," he said, as a form of explanation to no one in particular, and picked up the second one. Sophie watched him work his way through the remaining intruders with the methodical efficiency that she recognized, with a small jolt of something she did not immediately examine, as matching her own professional rhythm. Each one went out the window with the same clean, careful motion. No excessive force, no collateral damage to the walls or the floor or any of the restored fixtures. He was keeping her space intact. He closed the window when he was done. The latch clicked. He turned around. The entrance hall was undamaged. The floors were still gleaming. The sorted items had been disrupted, but could be respected. The Persian rug had one boot print, which Sophie was already moving toward with the stain remover, crouching down to assess the damage with her flashlight, pressing the pile gently with 2 fingers to check the fiber response. Ronan stood in the center of his cleared, organized, properly structured entrance hall and watched her kneel on the rug with her flashlight and her spray bottle, tending to the floor of his home, and the purr from 2 days ago came back with a force that sat behind his sternum like a held note. She had defended this space, not because it was her home, not because it was her property. She had charged an intruder with an industrial spray bottle because he had put a muddy boot on something she had cleaned with her hands, and the fury in her face had been completely genuine, and it had been directed not at the threat to herself, but at the threat to the work, to the order, to the nest she had spent 3 days building in the wreckage of his accumulated centuries. His wolf did not have access to nuanced language. It operated in the clean, declarative grammar of deep instinct, and what it said with complete certainty, watching Sophie Quinn press her thumb gently into the pile of the Persian rug and make a small relieved sound that the fibers had not been set, was this: she defends the den. Ronan picked up the suit of armor that had been knocked over during the commotion and set it back upright, carefully, in its designated position. Sophie looked up from the rug. She looked at the armor. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that she redirected very quickly into professional composure, and she looked back down at the rug. "The stain should lift," she said. "The fiber is intact." "Good," Ronan said. He picked up a fallen chair from the sorting station and set it back in position, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the fire in the restored fireplace threw warm light across the amber floor of Shadowcrest Manor, and the room was quiet. The invoice printed on the 4th morning. Sophie had a portable printer in the bottom of the utility cart because she had a system for everything, and the system for invoicing was that you printed it in the space, handed it to the client in the space, and closed the job cleanly before you left. It was a ritual as much as a procedure. It marked the line between the work and the after, the project and the completed project, the temporary occupation of someone else's space, and the clean return to your own life. She tore the invoice along the perforated edge and set it on the walnut side table in the living room, which had been restored to a condition that still made her quietly pleased every time she looked at it. Then she began packing. The color-coded bags had been collected 2 days ago. The specialist had returned for the last of the flagged items. The display room was finished, labeled, organized chronologically, and Ronan had stood in the doorway of it for a long time on the previous evening without saying anything, which she had learned by now meant something different from silence. The label maker had been responsible for 47 labels across the property, covering everything from the display room shelves to the storage crates in the cellar to a small laminated card she had affixed to the inside of the front door that read, "Outerwear, designated hook with an arrow," because even alpha kings needed reminders about coats. She folded the tarps with their edges aligned and slid them into their carry bag. She capped the cleaning solutions in order, tallest to shortest, and nestled them into the cart's lower tray. The microfiber cloths, laundered and folded last night, went into their zippered pouch. The measuring tape clicked back into its case. The flashlight. The intake forms, completed and clipped. The specialty wax, nearly empty, which she noted on her supply replenishment list. The label maker went last. She picked it up from the side table where she had left it the night before, and something in the ritual of closing it into her apron pocket felt, for the first time in her professional career, like a wrong note. She did not examine this. She pressed the pocket closed and picked up the utility cart handle. The entrance hall was beautiful. The amber floor caught the morning light coming through the tall windows flanking the door, and the warmth of it spread across the stone in a way that made the whole space feel inhabited rather than occupied, alive rather than endured. The gargoyles on their brackets cast small shadows. The coat hook by the door, installed by Sophie on day 2 using a bracket from her cart supplies, and one of Ronan's own tools that she had found under a pile of 17th century correspondence held a single dark coat. She had put that hook in herself. Sophie moved toward the front door. He was standing in front of it. She stopped. Ronan Blackwood stood with his back to the door, and his arms crossed, and the expression on his face of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to defend it against all reasonable objection. His jaw was set. His eyes, dark this morning, not red, held the particular quality of someone running on something deeper and more persistent than rational thought. He was also, she noted, still wearing his yellow rubber gloves. She had given them to him on day one as a client tool. He had worn them for every sorting session since, in the matter-of-fact way, he had eventually adopted the rest of the process, with the same reluctant, becoming genuine acceptance that had characterized his entire engagement with the project. He had deliberately put them back on this morning, standing there like a man prepared for a sorting session that they both knew was already over. "The invoice is on the table," Sophie said. "I see it. The job is complete. All deliverables finished, all systems installed, all items processed." "I know." Sophie looked at him. She looked at the door behind him. She looked at the cart. She set the cart handles down. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "are you blocking the door?" "Everything in this house," Ronan said, "has been put in its proper place." She recognized her own language. She had said that on day one, standing in the corridor with her measuring tape. Everything must have a place, and everything must be in it. That is the entire principle. Not minimalism for its own sake, not throwing things away for the pleasure of empty space, but the right object in the right location in the right relationship with everything around it. That is what makes a home function. That is what makes a space livable. "Yes," she said slowly, "you sorted every object in this house." His voice was careful in a way she had not heard before. Deliberate, like someone stepping onto uncertain ground with full awareness of what they were doing. "You assessed everything, assigned it a place, put it where it functions correctly." He paused. His jaw worked. "Everything except one thing." Sophie was very still. The morning light came through the tall windows. The amber floor held its warmth. The gargoyles cast their small shadows. "You haven't been sorted," Ronan said. It came out more gruff than it probably sounded in his head, but she heard what was underneath it, which was not gruffness at all. She opened her mouth, and then she closed it, because she did not have an immediate professional response to that, which was not a situation she was used to. Ronan's jaw moved. His arms uncrossed. He reached out, and before she fully processed what he was doing, his hand had gone into the pocket of her cargo apron with the focused intentionality of someone who knew exactly which pocket they were going for, and he pulled out the label maker. She watched him look at it. He turned it over once in his large hands, the yellow rubber gloves making the operation slightly unwieldy, and then he looked at the keyboard with the expression of a man who had commanded armies and was now confronting a miniature keyboard with 12-point font letters and finding it an unexpectedly worthy adversary. "That has a very small keyboard," Sophie said. He did not respond. He was typing. The process was slow and involved the careful deployment of one large finger at a time, and his jaw was tight, and there was color rising along the back of his neck that she had not seen before in 3 days of considerable provocation. He pressed print. The label maker made its small, satisfied beeping sound. He peeled the label with the same careful motion she used, which meant he had watched her do it enough times to absorb the technique, and he smoothed it onto her forehead with his thumb, the rubber glove cool against her skin, pressing it flat with a precise, deliberate motion. Then he stepped back and crossed his arms again and looked at somewhere to the left of her face with the expression of a man who had done something completely reasonable and was prepared to stand by it. Sophie reached up and peeled the label off her forehead. She looked at it. It had a pink border, because the label maker's last setting had been the pink border she had used for the non-essential but retained personal items in the back study, and he had not known how to change it, and evidently had decided the pink border was an acceptable casualty of the enterprise. The text read, "Property of Ronan. Do not discard." Sophie read it once, She read it again. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she was not usually aware of it during working hours. She looked up. Whatever Ronan saw in her face made something in him come loose, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and his arms came around her with the full, careful force of someone who had been holding something very tightly for a long time and had finally been given permission to put it down. He was enormous and warm, and he smelled like wood smoke and the cedar shelf liner she had installed on day 2, and he buried his face in her hair with the specific, boneless relief of something that had finally, after a very long time, come home. Sophie stood in the circle of his arms in the entrance hall of Shadowcrest Manor, the label still between her fingers, and felt the floor solid and warm beneath her feet, and let herself stay. "You've been officially sorted," he said into her hair, and it came out rough and quiet and entirely genuine. "Into my territory, my space, your nest," Sophie said. A pause. "I was going to say home," he said, with great dignity. "I know," she said. "That's what I meant." He held her tighter. She thought, in a detached and fond and professionally satisfied way, that she had worked a great many jobs. She had walked into spaces that had been locked for years, rooms that their owners had given up on, homes that had become containers for grief or avoidance, or the accumulated weight of time. She had always understood her work as a form of restoration, not discarding the past, but making room within it for something livable. You did not throw away what mattered. You found it a proper place, and you kept it there. 300 years of history lined the walls of this house. It was in the weapons on their labeled brackets, in the stones on the back study shelf, in the dented tin cup that she had not touched and would not touch, in the compass that had carried him across distances she could not fully imagine. None of it was gone. It was simply no longer buried under the weight of everything that had accumulated on top of it. She had not emptied this house. She had excavated it. And at the bottom, under the crates and the cursed artifacts and the 1,000 objects collected against some unconscious fear of emptiness, she had found this: a fireplace that still drew, and floors that were warm in the morning light, and a man who had held on to everything because he did not know that what he was waiting to hold was a person. She pressed the label carefully into her apron pocket. For keeps. Outside, the morning continued its ordinary business. Inside Shadowcrest Manor, for the first time in 300 years, there was enough room for 2. Thank you so much for reading the Alpha's decluttering method all the way to the end. If this story made you laugh, or gave you those warm, swoony feelings, or just made your day a little better, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Leave a comment below and tell me your favorite moment. Was it the rubber gloves, the spark joy axe, or the label on the forehead? I read every single one. Share this with a friend who needs a good love story today, and I will see you in the next one.